This episode was brought to you by Nail It and Scale It, the world's leading fast growth program for business.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Unstoppable. Today we have Peter Greste, award-winning foreign correspondent who spent over 25 years working for the BBC, Reuters, CNN, Al Jazeera, and some of the world's most volatile and violent places. After his 400-day imprisonment in Egypt on accusations of terrorism and inventing the news, Peter has made it his mission to advocate for media freedom everywhere. He is also the UNESCO Chair of Journalism and Communication at the University of Queensland. In 2014, Peter and two of his colleagues were actually arrested in Cairo while working for Al Jazeera and charged on terrorism offences, where they received a 7-year sentence. In letters that were smuggled from the prison, he described the arrest as attack on media freedom. The letters helped launch a global campaign that eventually got them released after more than 400 days in prison. Since then, Peter has gone on to become a global advocate and continued to campaign for press freedom everywhere. And it is with my great honour and pleasure to welcome today to Unstoppable, Peter. Great to have you here, mate.
Thanks very much, Kerwin. Great to join you.
Mate, you've got quite the story, and I guess the most. And look, and what's interesting, it seems to be a story that is becoming a lot more common than what it was going back, let's say 10 or 20 years ago. But I'm curious, apart from the thing that really puts you, and I guess there's a number of things that have put you on the map, but obviously the 400-day imprisonment is something that has got to be something significant in your life. How did you get into journalism in the first place?
Oh gosh. The honest truth is that it was because I didn't know what else to do. There was nothing else that grabbed me. I remember sitting at home the night before. I knew I wanted to study something, but I didn't know what on earth I wanted to do. And I remember here in Queensland, you had what was called the QTAC form, the Queensland Tertiary Admission Centre. And it was the way that you got into universities. They had a huge book that was about that with all of the courses that you could do. And I remember thinking, midnight before this form was due, I had not a clue what I wanted to do. So I remember thinking, if I don't know what I do want to do, let me get rid of everything I don't want to do. And I took a big felt pen and started crossing stuff off. Architecture, no. Accounting, no way. Medicine, no. Law, no. And I kept crossing until the only thing that was left. So I thought, okay, that's it there.
At that point, had you even considered journalism as a career?
No, I hadn't. But the thing that really enticed me, the thing that really got me into it was the license to indulge your curiosity. Yeah, right. I remember I nearly gave it away when I spoke to someone, a colleague, an old school friend who I hadn't seen for a while, who asked me what I was about to study. And I said, I'm going to do journalism. And she just went, oh my God, journalism. I said, well, what's wrong? And she said, English essays for the rest of your life. Until I realized that actually it's not about the writing. There are plenty of journalists who love writing and are in it because of the writing. For me, it was about curiosity. It was about a license to stick your nose into other people's business, to have an excuse to do that. And that's the thing that's always driven me.
And what area of journalism did you first cut your teeth in?
Oh, it was local journalism.
Right.
I went down to Shepparton to work in country Victoria, a local TV station called GMV6.
So how do you go from GMV6 to working for the likes of BBC, Reuters, CNN, and Al Jazeera? That's a big leap.
Yeah, it was a bit of a big leap. I kicked around Australian newsroom for a few years. I went from Shepparton to Darwin, and then from Darwin to Adelaide. I just got jobs in local TV stations, and I was in Adelaide working for the 10 Network. And I read this book called One Crowded Hour, which is a biography of an incredible Australian journalist called Neil Davis. And Davis covered Southeast Asia. He was one of the most courageous and most professional journalists I've ever come across. And he covered Laos and Cambodia, some incredible conflicts. And I read his biography and I thought, that's what I want to do. It's not so much that it was that I wanted to be on the front lines, although that's where I ended up. It's that I saw the work that he did with incredible integrity and incredible professionalism, combined with a really strong sense of social justice. and the adventure chucked in for good measure. And when I read the book, I was thinking about how I'm going to make that step when the 10 network went into receivership. They went broke at the time, and to save money, they closed down the London bureau. And I thought, well, look, it's ridiculous. You can't have one of the main Australian networks without a London correspondent. So I marched into my boss's office and said, listen, if I quit, if I resign my job here and take myself to London, will you use me as a freelance? And he said, sure, why not? We know you. We know what you can do. Go for it. And so that's what I did.
Wow. And so what year was that?
That was 1991. I'm showing my age here. November 1991. I did a bit of work for the network. I kicked around for a while and just started doing freelance gigs, and then followed a girl into Yugoslavia.
And is that where you started to move into the more volatile reporting space?
Yeah.
And not just because you followed a girl and because you're in a relationship with a girl in Yugoslavia. Well, I'm assuming the volatility wasn't just in the relationship.
It wasn't that I actually had the relationship. I kind of was hoping to develop something. No, I met this crazy Irish girl in a pub in London, which is a place where all good stories should start. And she was going off to this place called Medjugorje. She was on this Catholic pilgrimage. And Medjugorje was in the middle of a place called Herceg-Bosna, which is a Croat-controlled area of Bosnia, right in the heart of the conflict zone. But it was reasonably secure because of the way the Croats had managed to control it. And the place had always been a place of Catholic pilgrimage since the 1970s, when a group of young locals started seeing these visions of the Virgin Mary. And these pilgrimages were going all the way through the war, and I thought, what an amazing story. So I told, I said, this is extraordinary. And she said, well, why don't you come? And I mentioned it to two friends who work for the ABC and the Australian, and within a couple of days I got messages from the foreign editors of both saying, for God's sake, if you're at all thinking of going, let us know, because we really need freelance stories. And I thought, well, it's a no-brainer then. I've got the story, I've got the clients, and there's the girl. It's
the perfect scenario.
It is perfect, yeah. It didn't, sorry?
No, I was just going to say, so is that where you got introduced to volatile or to conflict zones? Is that?
Yeah, it pretty much was. I mean, things didn't go quite as I expected with the girl. It was hardly surprising, but I did actually learn not only that I really thrived in that kind of environment, I also learned that I was pretty good at it. I enjoyed it because it was obviously a physical challenge. Working and operating in that kind of environment on the front lines was incredibly challenging, but it was also an intellectual challenge as well. These stories are very complex, very difficult ones to tell, and there is no wiggle room. If you get it wrong, then you get into serious trouble. And I found all of this to be a really fascinating and exciting mix. And as I said, there was also a sense of social justice as well in there, that these were stories that I felt needed to be told. And so for all of those reasons, I kind of found my feet. So
did you actually get exposed to some significant conflict in some of the jobs that you were on?
Yeah. No, I went to Sarajevo that trip, and Sarajevo was under siege at that point.
Okay.
It was one of these things. I wasn't ever planning to go to Sarajevo, but I was doing a profile of an Australian military officer who was in command of the UNMOs, the UN military observers. And he was leaving his job to become the UN Secretary General's military advisor on the region. And I thought, well, it's a great chance to do a profile of him. I sold the idea to the Australian, but the only place that he had time to talk to me was in Sarajevo. So I thought, well, I'll just go in, I'll fly in there, I'll do the interview, and I'll get out. As it happened, I flew in, I did the interview, and then the Serbs opened up a big offensive and got stuck in Sarajevo for quite a few weeks and started reporting on the front lines. I managed to work with some of the other foreign journalists that were working as correspondents there, and they helped show me the ropes.
I've spoken to another correspondent, and one of the conversations I had was around the thrilling, adventurous like nature of working in, a conflict zone where there's a lot of unpredictability and volatility, and it's almost like walking around doing a bungee jump, 4 or 5 times a day. Were there any parts or points in your journey where you actually felt unsafe and you started going, shit, I wish I was just reporting back in Shepparton. I'd much rather be reporting about the Shepparton bakery and their latest feat on a pie right now than, staring down the barrel of this AK-47.
Look, I've often felt that I've pushed things too far. I mean, Sarajevo was the first opportunity I really had for that experience, but I was working with guys who are really good, right, and who knew and understood. I mean, I'm not one of these thrill seekers, someone who leaps into the unknown just for the sake of the adrenaline rush. I think there are a lot of adrenaline junkies in the business and not necessarily healthy. But I do believe that, that we've all each got our own tolerance for risk, and you kind of manage that tolerance. You manage the level of risk according to what you're comfortable with. I guess my tolerance for risk is perhaps a little bit higher than most people. But equally, I don't think I rarely push myself into places where I think I'm going to get into real trouble, although clearly I have. I mean, I remember a couple of times in Afghanistan when we were under fire, we were going out towards a front line one day. The government had said they'd taken this really strategically important military base that had been under the control of the Taliban. And I thought it was bullshit. I just didn't believe them. Strategically, tactically, it was too difficult. It would have been very, very difficult for them to take, and we hadn't seen the kind of military action that would have triggered that. And so I said, look, I'm going to go down and check. And they said, sure, go for it. So we went down, and as we approached the front line, I remember thinking, this is not going the way I imagined it. My little spidey sense was going. We pulled up by the side of the road next to some soldiers and said, listen, where's the front line? And they said, it's right here. And I said, what do you mean? And they said, yeah, you see those little blips up on the ridge there? And I said, yeah. And they said, they're tanks, and they're Taliban tanks. And right on cue, those tanks started firing. You could see little muzzle flashes from them. And we dived out of the car and hit under a culvert. And just as we did, there was the rounds started finding their range and started coming in around us. And we hunkered down under this culvert under the road while the tank barrage was hitting us. And when that happens, of course, what they're doing is trying to cover for an infantry advance. And so we knew that they were trying to keep us out of the way while they could bring up their ground troops. And so I realized that the last thing I wanted to do was to get stuck in a gun battle in a culvert where there was no way out with the Taliban when the tanks were heading. So we had to take a big deep breath and scoot out of there as soon as there was a bit of a lull in the firing when they had to reload the tanks.
What an experience. Wow. And so how much later was it that you found yourself in Egypt?
Oh, quite a few years, between there was time in Iraq and time in Latin America and in Somalia and Congo and Sudan and so on, a whole load of conflicts. I wound up in Egypt in the end of 2013. We were covering, I was working for Al Jazeera then. I left the BBC and moved over to Al Jazeera, and I was East Africa correspondent based out of Nairobi. And we were covering, as I said, Somalia, South Sudan, the ongoing war there, and Eastern Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, where there was a lot of fighting. I had a few trips to Iraq and to Baghdad and Lebanon and so on. And I was then called up to Cairo to cover the bureau in Al Jazeera for Al Jazeera just over the Christmas New Year period in 2013. I didn't think that there was anything particularly dramatic about it. There was an ongoing political crisis, but it hadn't really erupted into the kind of fighting that I'd seen elsewhere. And it was just really to tread water. We weren't doing anything particularly radical. You remember that around the end of 2013 was a period of political transition. There was a lot of the Muslim Brotherhood. To 2011, just for the sake of context, the Hosni Mubarak had been in charge for decades, in Egypt as a long-serving autocrat, and he'd been forced from power during the Arab Spring uprising there. A year later, there were fresh elections. There were the first democratic elections in Egypt's history, and the Muslim Brotherhood won those elections. And it survived for a year as the first democratically elected government in Egypt's history. But there was, again, a lot of public frustration and anger with the way that they were doing things. And so there were a lot of protests on the streets. The military stepped in and said, listen, we're a democracy now. You've lost the confidence of the people. You've got to go, and here's a gun to your head to make sure that you do it. And so the Muslim Brotherhood was ousted from power. There was an interim administration when we arrived, and there was a lot of conflict on the streets between rival supporters. And so it was volatile, but as I said, there wasn't open fighting at the time. I didn't know the story well. As a journalist, when you're in one of these places, you get a feel for the boundaries, for the edges, just how far you can push a story before you're going to end up in trouble. Egypt wasn't one of those places, so I was playing with a very straight bat. The government would announce some changes to the constitution. We'd pick up the phone and call the opposition for a reaction, and then you'd find an analyst to make sense of it all. Just so happens that the opposition was the party that was last in power. That was the Muslim Brotherhood, and the government really didn't take kindly to that. They'd started accusing the Brotherhood of being involved in acts of terrorism. And so it turns out that by talking to the Brotherhood, we became guilty of, in the government's eyes, of advocating terrorist ideology. And so we were arrested on the night of December 28th, 2013. I had no idea that was coming, of course. This was all down in the future. I was just sort of hanging out in my hotel room, getting ready to go out for dinner with a friend of mine who I hadn't seen for a while. And when the security agents burst into the room.
Wow. And do you remember that moment well, like when that door first swung open?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember it like it was yesterday.
And what did you think? Like, what do you remember thinking? Oh my God, they've found me, but they didn't. I don't know what for.
I didn't know. I mean, it took a few moments. So what happened was that there was a knock on the door. That in itself was unusual. Usually, whenever anybody wanted me, they used the phone. But I didn't think too much of it. I remember cracking open the door. I didn't bother looking through the peephole, and as I did, it was sort of flung in as if there was a powerful spring behind it. I was pushed to the back of the room. There were about 8 or 10 guys who came in. I still honestly don't remember how many there were. And they started ransacking the place. They searched it. They grabbed all of my gear, my phone, my laptop, my cameras, all of my gear. And
at this stage, were these guys presented in military uniform? Plain clothes. Okay, so this is
no, plain clothes. Yeah. I had no idea, and they didn't. I didn't know who they were, whether they were police or thugs. Egypt has a bit of a reputation for lawlessness. It was a major hotel. It was the Marriott Hotel, so it was unlikely to be the room was being raided by a gang of thugs. But it wasn't immediately clear. But they moved with a degree of professionalism that said that these guys had been trained, and one of them was clearly in charge. And I demanded to see a search warrant. He said, "Look, can you speak Arabic?" I said, "No." And he said, "Well, there's no point." And he told me that I was being taken in for questioning by the police. And so I was marched down to, again, at this point, I still had no idea what the hell was going on. They wouldn't tell me anything. They marched me down and threw me into a room which was being used as a police office, I guess, in the ground floor of the hotel. One of my colleagues, Mohammed Fahmy, was also brought in, and we ended up in the police cell for the next few nights.
400 days.
Well, initially in the police cell for about 3 or 4 days. It was crazy. It was a very cramped kind of cell. Box was about 8 foot by 8 foot square.
So the equivalent of like a Egyptian remand center. Yeah.
This tiny box, as I said, 8 foot by 8 foot, but with 16 guys crammed in there.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. You sort of picture it in your head.
And at what point did you start to realize that there was perhaps another agenda going on? And you realized it was a little bit more serious?
Well, we we were interrogated by the National Intelligence Director, the Interior Police, the secret police. And I was told then that the charges, it took a few days for them to tell me what the charges were, but it was, when we heard them, it was blown away. As you said in your introduction, we're accused of being members of a terrorist organisation, aiding and abetting a terrorist organisation, financing a terrorist organisation, broadcasting false news with intent to undermine national security. I mean, when you think about it, these charges are about as serious as you could possibly get, short of pulling the pin on a grenade and throwing it into the middle of a crowded room. This was incredibly serious. But I struggled for a long time to reconcile that gap between the seriousness of those charges and the very ordinary journalism that we were actually doing. I couldn't see how anybody could balance these two things, or look at the evidence and to the conclusion that we'd somehow been engaged in acts of terrorism. And I wrestled with this for a very long time until I finally realized, after a few conversations, because I was moved into another prison where initially I spent some time in solitary confinement, and then started to have some contact with my neighbours, who were all members of all the activists who were responsible for the original revolution that toppled Hosni Mubarak. These were the guys that organised the protests that brought millions of people onto the streets. And so they're very, very savvy political operators. And they helped me understand and unpack what was going on. I realised that it wasn't about anything we'd done. It wasn't about our journalism per se. It was about what we'd come to represent. And that was that was prepared to interrogate all of the parties involved in the conflict and to hold the governments to account. And that was something that they didn't want. And they were using us as an opportunity to send a message to all journalists that were operating in Egypt. And that's when I wrote the letters and smuggled those letters out, declaring this not to be an assault on us, but an assault on press freedom.
And that was, what year was that?
That was, well, it was the end of 2013 that I was arrested. And by the time this unfolded, it was early 2014.
And what were your biggest lessons? Because obviously when you're sitting in jail for 400 days, especially when you're being accused of crimes that you've not only not committed, but you're not involved with in any way, shape or form, I can only imagine that gives you a lot of time to think, reflect, and ponder. What did you spend that time doing, and how did it affect you?
There are a lot of lessons. I mean, I guess depends on, where do you want to go with this, Kerwin? There are lessons, there are personal lessons, and there are also lessons around activism, I suppose. I mean, the lessons, the personal lessons that I learned were things around discipline and order. And I guess these are lessons that a lot of people are relearning, and I'm certainly relearning at the time of lockdown. We're locked down here in Brisbane at the moment. I'm having to remember some of the stuff that I learned then. And one is around, the first lesson I think I learned was that your head is your own worst enemy. I realized very quickly that prison was sending a lot of the guys that I was with crazy. They'd been in incredibly difficult situations for a very long time, and they were losing touch with reality. I realized when I saw them that actually physically we had all that we needed for survival. Food, it wasn't necessarily great food, but it was enough. It was nutrition. It would keep you alive. We had potable water, and we had a solid roof over our heads, the one thing that the Egyptian prison system is very good at providing. And so in that environment, food, water, shelter, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that's all you need. We weren't being physically tortured. We got knocked around a few times by some of the guards, but nothing that was ever life-threatening. And in that environment, the only thing that's left is your own head. And that's what prison is designed to do. It's designed to mess with your head. It's designed to put you under psychological pressure by physically constraining you. But it's the psychology of it that lies at the base of it. when I realized that fundamentally it's a mental problem, and I will either survive or die in my own head.
Mm.
And so that's where your focus has to be. And that means that you need to focus on being mentally active, not allowing yourself to lose touch with the diurnal rhythms. You've got to sleep at night and wake up during the day. I never laid down during the day. I didn't want my body to learn that it was okay to lie on my bed during the day. I wanted to make sure that I was always up and active during the day and always horizontal and sleep at night. It sounds like a small thing, but those routines, those rhythms, those diurnal rhythms are really important to staying sane and mentally strong and healthy. Always kept a program of physical exercise going. The Australian Embassy was able to give me a program called 5BX, which is 5 basic exercises. It's fairly popular online. It was designed by the Canadian Air Force to give their airmen a way of staying fit if they're ever captured and held in confined spaces. And it's become a bit of an internet sensation since then. I found it to be very, very fantastically helpful at giving me an exercise routine. And we needed to be spiritually strong. So some years earlier, I went through a pretty difficult breakup, and to try and steady the ship, I went and did a meditation course. It was a Vipassana course, a fairly hardcore,
Vipassana.
10 days.
Yeah. I call that the full contact meditation. It's like, it's probably one of the hardest meditation disciplines that I've ever had to learn. I went and did it 7 times in the end, but then you understand it. I understand the difficulty.
Understand it exactly.
Yeah.
And here's the thing, Kerwin. I remember when I went into the cell, and particularly through solitary confinement, they closed the door and said, "Listen, you're on your own." I thought, well, I've actually got the tools for this. I've been here before, and as you know, Vipassana is a very, very difficult 10 days of silent meditation where you have no contact, no verbal contact with anybody, no eye contact with anybody. There's no reading material, no writing material. You're just alone with your own head. But it does give you a structure, a disciplined way of observing yourself, observing your own mental reactions, your mental processes. And that was the way in which I was able to monitor and observe my own reactions to prison.
Wow. Yeah, wow.
And I'm absolutely convinced that without that training beforehand, I'd have been in a much more serious situation.
That's incredible. Okay, that's really interesting. You also mentioned other lessons apart from personal lessons on activism. Tell me about those.
Yeah, so there was one of my cellmates was a guy called, or one of my neighbors rather, was a guy called Allah Abdel Fattah, who was an incredible man who was still imprisoned in Egypt. An amazing secular intellectual, but he's very charismatic. And he's still in prison precisely because he is such an extraordinary character. And he'd been imprisoned by every regime in Egypt, from Hosni Mubarak to the Muslim Brotherhood, the interim government, and now under the current government of Allah Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. And he told me that the power of a voice from behind the bars. He explained just how powerful and important a letter would be from prison. I didn't really appreciate it. I didn't really understand it. I wrote the letter on toilet paper and we smuggled it out. And I had no idea how much of an impact that note would have. It really gave my family a license to campaign on my behalf, to speak openly about the issue of press freedom. It unleashed my colleagues around the world, my journalism colleagues. And I know for a fact, too, that letter made it to Barack Obama's desk. He saw it and decided to also get actively involved and spoke to President Sisi a lot. So that letter seemed to change the dynamic. Now, I can't put my finger on the letter and say that was the key thing. In fact, I can't put my finger on anything that got me out of prison. But I'm absolutely convinced that without the advice of Allah, things would have turned out very differently.
Huh. And so now we kind of, we enter an age where we're a few years down the track, a global pandemic, 18 months into, and there seems to be a lot of discussion about freedom of speech, freedom of press, misinformation, disinformation, information wars. And I think it's probably fair to say, and I hope you don't mind me saying this, because I think you may understand where someone like myself is coming from. I'm not an academic. I've never been schooled in journalism, but I have, been someone that's grown up with a distrust for the news, just based on how I see the news has been presented, how I see the news has been manipulated. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm a law-abiding citizen, but I feel like some other people out there, I've grown up with a bit of a distrust of the news. And by the way, I grew up in a family that watched the news every night. It was at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock, whenever it was, news came on, the whole family would sit down and watch the news. I grew up reading the newspaper, all those kinds of things. And what I've discovered is over time, I've started to become less trusting in news sources, less trusting in where the information is coming from, what the agenda is. And I'm going to assume that I'm not the only one, because I know that there have been many other people that are speaking up, even now around censorship on the social media platforms. Where do you think we are when it comes to freedom of speech or freedom of press? Or are they two completely separate things that just happen to, cohabitate in the same area?
So I think I agree with you. Trust is a big problem. There's an annual survey called the Edelman Trust Barometer, which shows trust in media around the world is at an all-time low. And part of that is the fault of journalists themselves. I don't think journalists have always covered themselves in glory. Part of the fault is because of the changes in the industry, which have rewarded speed over accuracy, polemic over sober analysis, the sensational over serious stories, and that doesn't help us. But that's also partly due to the way that the internet has changed the funding models of journalism. I think that the problem is also part of the way in which the internet has allowed people to seek whatever information they want in a way that confirms their own biases rather than Trump often often spoke about fake news, and then, but it turns out that he was one of the greatest purveyors of fake news. What he spoke of, he made a famous remark in an interview with a CNN journalist, in which he said that he was asked about why he says some of the conspiracy theories that he did. He said, "I do it because I want to make it so that people don't know what the truth really is." He wanted to create this kind of fog of confusion, and that's very real. It's not just Trump's own fault, but it's created an environment where it's very difficult for people to know what to trust, because they can get anything confirmed, anything they believe confirmed outside of journalism. Now, you spoke about freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Freedom of speech is a very broad subject. It's a very broad kind of umbrella idea that covers all sorts of things, including freedom of religion, freedom of association, but also freedom of the press. So press freedom is a subset of freedom of speech. But I think it's a really important subset, because for all of the flaws, the whole point of journalism is to hold the powerful to account. It's to create a professional class of individuals who have the time, the resources, the skills, the experience, the capacity to hold our political classes to account, the people who have power and control over us. And if you imagine a world where you take that class out, then all of a sudden, if you see a world where all we have the only information that we have about the behaviour of our politicians and our civil servants is through their news releases and Facebook feeds and Twitter posts. Now, I'm not sure about you, but that's not the kind of world that I feel particularly comfortable with. I think we need that class of individuals. We need a class of professionals who has the capacity and the resources to to interrogate government, to dig up the stories that our politicians would rather keep hidden. It's not always edifying, it's not always pretty, and it's deeply flawed, as any human endeavour is. But most professional journalists, most journalists who work for credible news organisations, spend an enormous amount of time trying to make sure that the basis of their stories are accurate. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not biased. We're all humans, and bias inevitably creeps in. But I'd wager that, well, let me ask you this, Kerwin, where have you been going for your news about COVID, for example?
Well,
has it been to social media, or do you?
Well, in the early days, I was probably, scouring a range of different news sites. And this is where it gets actually interesting. This might be a curveball you didn't expect. But about 12 months ago, I started an intelligence. I went out and hired a guy who had 18 years in signals intelligence, working in the intelligence for special operations for the Australian Defence Force. And I put together an intelligence service whereby him and a couple of operators would essentially scour different sources of information that was based on a criteria of trusted information that the intelligence community uses, and they would produce a brief for me twice a week. And in most cases I would still go to news.com, Sydney Morning Herald, and I'd still look at those bits and pieces just to see what the general temperature of mainstream news was. But 95% of my consumption came from the intelligence that we accumulated from a range of different sources around the world.
But let me ask you: was that markedly different from what you were seeing on the main news sites? Did it suggest that the journalists were hiding things or were involved in conspiracy?
There was a lot. Well, put it this way: one of the reasons I did, there was a lot less noise. There was a lot less, I guess you could say, conflicting information. The speed of information was a lot faster, but fundamentally, no. And this is what was, I guess, what you could say is interesting, because I was looking to be able to uncover aspects of, certain angles of conspiracy, and the reality was we couldn't find a great deal. We could find a lot of, discussion and debate and unverified information, intelligence, and data, but to find verified intelligence to confirm a lot of the stuff that was being assumed, it was almost impossible.
Well, that's my point, that the system is imperfect, but by and large, professional journalists will tend to get the core of the story right, frankly. That's not to say, as I said, that there isn't bias in there. I mean, if you have a look at some of the debate around lockdowns, the viability or the value of lockdowns, and you'll see differences of opinion, and you'll see different news organisations leaning one way or the other. But most people would agree with you, and when I say most people, I'm saying this on the basis of some pretty solid empirical evidence that shows that when COVID broke up, most people, a large majority of people, swung back to legacy news services. News consumption went up. The amount of time that people spent online on those news services went up, and trust in those news organisations also went up. I think that's because people understood that actually, when you have this vast fog of confusion online about what to do, what not to do, the risks and so on, that ultimately journalists who had the time and the capacity to research this stuff were doing a pretty good job. Let me stress, it wasn't perfect. There will always be people, there will always be examples that you can show me where the system is broken down, and I accept that. But
so what do we do in a scenario or in a world where we have, a difference of opinion at a broadcast or a journalistic level? Because I have read, a number of articles by, different journalists who, advocate for open borders, who advocate for, bringing things back to a level of norm, suggesting that COVID is nothing more than a severe flu. But then I've also seen, a lot of journalists on the flip side of that saying that, the complete opposite. And I guess it's in scenarios like that the public go, well, fuck, who do we listen to when you've got the same newspaper saying two different things?
Well, I think that's what public debate is all about. Okay, I think in Australia, for example, we've had this debate, but I think we've largely settled on the idea that lockdowns are necessary. They're painful, but they're necessary. There'll still be people who there'll be that ongoing debate in the fringes. But by and large, I think the community as a whole has accepted that this is the way we should go. And that is the result of, I would argue, good, solid reporting where there's been a consistency about a consistent consensus about what the basic facts of the story are. In the early days, there was some debate about just how serious COVID was until we started to get to understand that it was deadly and highly contagious and potentially incredibly damaging. And we came to a consensus, and that's the way good journalism and a good media environment ought to work. That doesn't mean that there isn't still out there a whole load of rubbish, a whole load of bullshit around COVID treatments, for example, on social media. That doesn't mean that on the fringes you can't find it. But in the mainstream, on mainstream news services that are organised and produced and written by journalists, you'll find a reasonably consistent consensus. And I think that's the way the system ought to work. I'm not saying there's no validity on the kind of with the stuff that you get on social media, but we need to understand that that social media is not verified. It's not professionally produced. It's not held to account for what's produced on social media. Journalists are held accountable for what they write. They put their bylines to it. They stand by it. They won't always get it perfect, but at least you know who you can complain to if you see something that you believe is wrong or completely off the mark.
Based on what you've said on the nature of the freedom of press, it seems to me journalists have a massive responsibility when it comes to open, honest, transparent documentation and an account, which to me would probably infer that the people that are doing the reporting need to be held to an incredibly high standard, of integrity and account as well. So considering where we are, where there is more people now people trust news sources less than they've ever been able to trust them before. Yes, we are seeing a reversion, but how do journalists, outside of just, reporting based on the facts and what is true, how do we fix the problem? Because it seems to me that the problem's only going to get worse before it gets better. But, at some point, somebody's got to resuscitate a level of integrity around, information delivery, news service delivery in a way that, is supposed to do what the job it was employed for in the first place, which was to uphold that class.
Yeah, and you're right. And that's why I said that journalists have sometimes been their own worst enemy by being too fast or too sloppy or unprofessional in the way that they've covered things or gone after clicks rather than integrity. I recognise that these are problems, but funny enough that you should ask. We actually have a few ideas about how to deal with this. And the internet offers some solutions. There are some people working on technologies at the moment to record and document how the sausage is made, to make it clear. So it's possible for you to put online all of the sources, all of the background information, the original interviews, all of the details about how you collated your information and how you put it together, for someone who is interested to go through all of that background material.
Yeah, right.
To unthread it and see how, what you actually did, how to literally see how the sausage was put together. I think that would be very powerful and very useful way of giving people confidence in what they're seeing. My organisation, the Alliance for Journalist Freedom, is also talking about introducing a system of certifying journalists. We're not talking voluntary certification for journalists. Yep. We're not talking about accreditation in the way that you have a license to operate, because we understand that anybody who has a keyboard and an internet connection ought to be able to publish whatever they want. But what we're saying is that if you apply to a certifying body to be recognized as a journalist, you would have to demonstrate a professional process, that you would have to show how you produce stories. You would have to show a commitment to to ethical standards and principles, to a complaints process and so on. And if you go through that process, what the certifying body will allow you to put something like a blue tick, it would be its own little mark that you could put on social media. So that people would recognize that this work is produced by someone who is recognized by their peers as working to a professional standard, to a professional degree of integrity. And we think that that would provide upward pressure from people who want to be certified, to be recognized. We think that certification would give social media companies the tools, a tool that they could use to elevate and prioritize those stories produced by certified journalists. And we also think that it would give the public confidence to know that what they're reading is produced by someone who knows what they're doing. And so we think that there are ways in which we can distinguish really good journalism from everything else. Now, that doesn't mean that anyone who is not certified couldn't practice, but we want to be able to find a way of recognizing and rewarding those who are very good at what they do.
We seem to be moving into an age of censorship, and I think it was a lot easier to censor people when there was less channels of communication. Now we have more channels of communication, more freedom of access and use of the publication on those channels. But we also have an increasing level of censorship, especially around, sensitive subjects. Corona is one of them. Politics is another. Corona seems to be the one that, is most on the radar, because I'm pretty sure most people have seen, a censorship symbol, or, have seen get your facts straight on the COVID when people are posting and have got, keywords and phrases in there. What are you seeing are the problems with the current forms of censorship, and how do you see that there is a place for censorship? And if so, how would it be used and policed in a way that is moral and ethical based on the situation where we're in right now?
Okay, a huge question.
We'll finish with the little one.
Yeah, how many more hours have we got to deal with this? Look, for a start, censorship in the classic form, in the sense of a government going through things before they're published, is something that I'm very uncomfortable with. And we don't have that. There's very little of that direct kind of censorship that's going on at the moment. There is an awful lot of surveillance, which I think is also something we need to be very careful of and aware of. But that's another subject altogether. What I'm concerned about at the moment is the way in which most of the censorship, the control over the flow of information, whether it's through journalists or on social media, through other social media channels, is that the power lies with the social media companies. And as we saw just earlier this week, just a few days ago, in the case of Sky News, YouTube executives sitting in California have decided to take an Australian channel off YouTube because they deemed that YouTube was breaching their community standards. Now, I have a real problem with that. We don't know exactly why YouTube hasn't been transparent about what community standards Sky News supposedly breached. I believe, there's a lot that Sky publishes which I think is dangerous and probably should not be allowed on air, but I don't think that someone sitting in California ought to have the power to decide what an Australian network can and cannot be publishing without any way for Sky News or anybody else complaining or holding them to account for that decision. It's completely out of our jurisdiction. So I think there needs to be a way of making sure, and by the way, they talk about community standards, breaching community standards in social media companies, as if that the community standards that are set in Palo Alto in California are the same community to apply here in Australia or in Nairobi in Kenya or in Dhaka and Bangladesh or anywhere else around the world. You can't do that. The communities don't work the same way. They aren't common around the world. Each community has its own set of standards and values and things that will breach those standards. And we need to be very careful. Let me give you a very quick example.
Please.
Facebook ran an experiment. They've got their oversight board, which is supposed to be a kind of Supreme Court of Facebook. And they tested tested a meme that was going around on Facebook with a young girl and a pretty little girl, ribbons in her hair and a tutu and so on, and a thought bubble or speech bubble saying "kill all men." And it was kind of amusing. It was a little bit off color. It was a feminist joke, and it kind of, when they tested that with everybody in the West, they also look, this should be fine. It's free speech. Perhaps it's a little bit on edge, but come on, we ought to have a sense of humor. When they tried it in Africa, and they tried it in Nairobi, a lady from Ethiopia walked out. She said, "This is unconscionable." She said, "This is the kind of language that was used to trigger genocide, the kind of hate speech that mobilizes people to get people out to kill them, to murder their neighbors." She said, this is simply unacceptable. We saw it in Rwanda. We've been seeing it in Ethiopia. We've seen it in Kenya and a whole host of other countries across Africa. This is simply unacceptable. And when you see and understand that this isn't about censoring political speech that's challenging a government, it's about censoring speech that's appropriate for a particular community. And I don't think it's appropriate, therefore, for someone in California to be making judgments in a way that is completely unaccountable. That's the kind of censorship that I have problems with. And I think it's incumbent on governments, even though I don't trust governments any more than anybody else, I still think that the judicial systems ought to be set up in a way that allows them to manage and police and control not just the flow of information, but the way in which social media companies manage that flow in our own countries, because this is where we set the rules for our own communities, not overseas in the US.
Peter, I have to say I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, so much so we might have to get you back on for a part 2. Mate, you've also written a book that you wrote back in 2017 called The First Casualty. Is that now also still available, just out of curiosity?
It's still available. You might struggle to find it in shops, but it's certainly online.
Where can people find out more about you, mate?
Dig around. There's an awful lot on YouTube.
Are you on the social channels? Do you have a website?
I don't have a website, but my social media channels are there. I'm on Twitter and I'm on Facebook.
Fantastic.
The Alliance for Journalist Freedom has a website where you'll find a lot of our information. That's where we do a lot of work and a lot of writing as well.
Mate, thank you very much. And for what you've been through, I appreciate, your openness, your humility, and also your humor. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been Peter Greste on Unstoppable. Thank you, Peter.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
This episode is brought to you by Nail It and Scale It, the world's leading fast growth program for businesses. If you have ever wanted to grow your business faster than what you can right now, if you need to make more revenue, if you need more leads, if you need more clients, if you need to know how to plan your business in a strategic way in order to hit big goals, if you need to learn how to scale your business and grow your team and your business so that you have more freedom, then this program is for you. Imagine 3 days immersed with me where we cover all aspects of business, but we do it from an immersive but also an execution standpoint. We execute every step of the way. And we're looking at 5 key areas. We're looking at your psychology. We're looking at your marketing, your sales, your leadership, and we're looking at your planning and how we integrate these 5 key areas to grow your business and your brand quickly. So if you'd like to find out more information, kerwinray.com.